Currently, Earth.
It was February 8th in the year 1887, in a well-meaning but ultimately flawed attempt to assimilate Native Americans, that our 22nd and 24th President, Grover Cleveland, signed an act to end tribal control of the reservations and divide their land into individual holdings. Named for its chief author, Senator Henry Lawrence Dawes from Massachusetts, the Dawes Severalty Act reversed the long-standing American policy of allowing Indian tribes to maintain the traditional practice of communal use and control of their lands. Instead, the Dawes Act gave the president the power to divide Indian reservations into individual, privately owned plots. The act dictated that men with families would receive 160 acres, single adult men were given 80 acres, and boys received 40 acres. Women received no land. The most important motivation for the Dawes Act was Anglo-American hunger for Indian lands. The act provided that after the government had doled out land allotments to the Indians, the sizable remainder of the reservation properties would be open for sale to whites. Consequently, Indians eventually lost 86 million acres of land, or 62% of their total pre-1887 holdings. Still, the Dawes Act was not solely a product of greed. Many religious and humanitarian friends of the Indian supported the act as a necessary step towards fully assimilating the Indians into American culture. Reformers believed that Indians would never bridge the chasm between barbarism and civilization if they maintained their tribal cohesion and traditional ways. J.D.C. Atkins, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, argued that the Dawes Act was the first step towards transforming idleness, improvidence, ignorance, and superstition into industry, thrift, intelligence, and Christianity. In reality, the Dawes Severalty Act proved a very effective tool for taking land from Indians and giving it to Anglos, but the promised benefits to the Indians never materialized. Racism, bureaucratic bungling, and inherent weakness in the law deprived the Indians of the strengths of tribal ownership, while severely limiting the economic viability of individual ownership. Many tribes also deeply resented and resisted the government's heavy-handed attempt to destroy their traditional cultures. Despite these flaws, the Dawes Severalty Act remained in force for more than 4 decades. In 1934, the Wheeler-Howard Act repudiated the policy and attempted to revive the centrality of tribal control and cultural autonomy on the reservations. The Wheeler-Howard Act ended further transfer of Indian lands to Anglos and provided for a return to voluntary communal Indian ownership, but considerable damage had already been done. It was on February 8th in the year 1915 that D.W. Griffiths' The Birth of a Nation, a landmark film in the history of cinema, premieres at Clunes Auditorium in Los Angeles. The film was America's first feature-length motion picture and a box office smash, and during its unprecedented 3 hours, Griffith popularized countless filmmaking techniques that remain central to the art today. However, because of its explicit racism, Birth of a Nation is also regarded as one of the most offensive films ever made. Actually titled The Klansman for its first month of release, the film provides a highly subjective history of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Studied today as a masterpiece of political propaganda, Birth of a Nation caused riots in several cities and was banned in others, but was seen by millions. David Wark Griffith was born in LaGrange, Kentucky in 1875, the son of an ex-Confederate colonel. His father continued his fraternity when he was 7, and he later dropped out of high school to help support his family. After holding various jobs, he began a successful career as a theater actor. He wrote several plays, and on the advice of a colleague, sent some scenarios for One Reel Films to the Edison Film Company and the Biograph Company. In 1908, he was hired as an actor and writer for the Biograph Studio and soon was promoted to a position as director. Between 1908 and 1913, Griffith made more than 400 short films for Biograph. With the assistance of his talented cinematographer, G.W. Billy Bitzer, he invented or refined such important cinematic techniques as the close-up, the scenic long shot, the moving camera shot, and the fade-in and fade-out. His contributions to the art of editing during his period include the flashback and parallel editing, in which two or more separate scenes are intermixed to give the impression that the separate actions are happening simultaneously. He also raised the standard on movie acting, initiating screen rehearsals before shooting and assembling a stock company of film professionals. Many of these actors, including Lillian and Dorothy Gish, Mary Pickford, Mae Marsh, Lionel Barrymore, all went on to become some of Hollywood's first movie stars. Taking his cue from the longer spectacle films produced in Italy in 1913, Griffith produced Judith of Bethulia, a biblical adaptation that, at 4 reels, was close to an hour long. It was his last biograph film. 2 years later, he released his 10-reel film, Birth of a Nation, for Mutual Films. Birth of a Nation, based on Thomas Dixon's novel, The Klansman, tells the turbulent story of American history in the 1860s as it followed the fictional lives of 2 families from the North and the South. Throughout its 3 hours, African Americans are portrayed as brutish, lazy, morally degenerate, and dangerous. In the film's climax, the Ku Klux Klan rises up to save the South from the Reconstruction-era prominence of African Americans in Southern public life. Riots and protests broke out at screenings of Birth of a Nation in a number of northern cities, and the recently formed National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, embarked on a major campaign to have the film banned. It eventually was censored in several cities, and Griffith agreed to change or cut out some of the film's especially offensive scenes. Nevertheless, millions of people paid to witness the spectacle of Birth of a Nation, which featured a cast of more than 10,000 people and a dramatic storyline far more sophisticated than anything released to that date. For all the gross historical inaccuracies, certain scenes such as meetings of Congress, Civil War battles, and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln were meticulously recreated, lending the film an air of legitimacy that made it so effective as propaganda. The Ku Klux Klan, suppressed by the federal government in the 1870s, was refounded in Georgia in December 1915 by William J. Simmons. In addition to being anti-black, the new Klan was anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, and anti-immigrant, and by the early 1920s it had spread throughout the North as well as the South. At the peak of its strength in 1924, membership in the KKK is estimated to have been as high as 3 million. There is no doubt that Birth of a Nation played no small part in winning wide public acceptance for an organization that was originally founded as an anti-black and anti-federal terrorist group. Of Griffith's later films, Intolerance, a film that was released in 1916, is the most important. Hailed by many as the finest achievement of the silent film era, it pursues 4 storylines simultaneously, which cumulatively act to prove humanity's propensity for persecution. Some regard it as an effort at atonement by Griffith for Birth of a Nation, while others believe he meant it as an answer to those who persecuted him for his political views. Intolerance was a commercial failure, but did have a significant influence on the development of film art. Griffith went on to make 27 more films. In 1919, he founded United Artists with Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, and Charlie Chaplin. Before D.W. Griffith's time, motion pictures were short, uninspiring, and poorly produced, acted and edited. Under his guidance, filmmaking became an art form. Despite the harm Birth of a Nation inflicted on humanity, D.W. Griffith is known as the father of cinema. It was February 8th in 1968 that police officers in Orangeburg, South Carolina opened fire on a crowd of young people during a protest against racial segregation. 3 people continued their eternity, and 30 others were wounded. The continuance of eternity of 3 young African Americans at the hands of state officials, 4 years after racial discrimination had been outlawed by federal law, has gone down in history as the Orangeburg Massacre. After decades of protests across the country, segregation was abolished in the U.S. by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. While this passage was a major victory, many racists throughout the South simply refused to obey it, knowing local police would not care to enforce it. In early February of 1968, a group of activists in Orangeburg tried to convince one such man, Harry Floyd, to desegregate his bowling alley, but he refused. Several days of expanding protests followed, during which protesters damaged a window of the bowling alley. Police responded with arrests and beatings, and unrest spread to the nearby campus of South Carolina State University, a historically black college. The night of February 8th, officers of the South Carolina Highway Patrol responded to a bonfire on the campus. When a protester pried a banister from an abandoned house and threw it at an officer, the police opened fire. The Highway Patrol would subsequently claim, and the newspapers would subsequently report, that the students had used firebombs and even sniper rifles to attack before the police fired. However, multiple investigations of the incident failed to turn up any evidence to support the claims. The police's barrage of bullets struck two SCSU students, Samuel Hammond Jr. and Henry Smith, as well as a local high school student, Delano Middleton, who had been sitting near the protest waiting for his mother to get off work. This horrific event sparked outrage across the nation, but the governor of South Carolina blamed Black Power advocates rather than his police. The massacre is still commemorated by the university and others in South Carolina, but social commentators have noted that its place in America's collective memory is not as prominent as that of the similar Kent State and Jackson State massacres, both of which occurred during anti-Vietnam War protests, in which collectively, during both events, 6 white students continued their fraternity in 1970. Shootings on college and high school campuses continue to plague the United States, as does police violence against African Americans. Nearly 1,000 people each year continue their eternity at the hands of the police. Black people are 2.5 times more likely to be shot by the police than white people. On February 8th in 1986, Oprah Winfrey becomes the first black woman in modern history to host a nationally syndicated talk show. Gary Coleman was also born on this day in 1968. 10 years later, Leon Spinks defeated Muhammad Ali for the heavyweight title in 1978 on this day. The information documented on this audio file can be verified on history.com.